Texas Fight, Book 8 of the America Fall series, written by Scott Medbury, narrated by Adam Barr. Copyright 2022 Scott Medbury, all rights reserved. Episode 3. Chapter 11. Colonel Jiang Li's cigarette smoke dissipated in the warm night air. He stood off a side road of hard-packed dirt and weeds. With little in the way of trees or buildings, a gust of wind rumbled over the fields and stirred the hair on Li's head. Squinting out into the dark and taking another drag, he spotted a man slinking out from the tall grass, breaking into a slow jog when he reached the road. "Private Shu," Jiang Li spoke, flicking ash to his side and noticing he was alone. He had expected all three of them. "Where are Shang and Shong?" The soldier stiffened, trying to catch his breath. He was a short, slim man with a buzz cut close to the scalp. His small frame was exactly why he had been picked for this particular role. Quick and easy to disappear.
"They missed the rendezvous, sir,"
Shu said.
"Did you wait long?"
A nod.
"Yes, sir. 2 hours, sir."
"Did your source have anything to say on the matter?"
"Yes,"
the private said, looking scared to continue.
"Tell me."
"My informant confirmed that 2 People's Army soldiers were killed in Cold Spring, and that they also lost one of their own."
This wasn't ideal. Not ideal at all, if word from their guerrilla camp was to be believed. Jiang Li needed to present better findings to General Wang Hao, so he pressed on.
"And did you obtain the details about the planned attack?
"Yes, sir, but—"
Shu interrupted. Jiang Li lashed out and slapped his subordinate across the face. As quick as his anger had appeared, it subsided, and he threw his cigarette away.
"Do not interrupt me again."
"Yes, sir."
"But what?"
he sighed, turning and walking back toward the main road, the private marching in his wake.
"One of the 3 you seek is dead. He was killed in the engagement with Shang and Shong."
"I see. Pity. I wanted to torture all 3 of them. Was it the girl?"
"No, sir. The taller of the 2 boys. Not the leader."
Li nodded.
"Good. So the target is the fuel facility."
"Yes, sir,"
said Shu, not sure if he should proceed.
"Speak, idiot! When? Where?"
"My source confirmed it will be tomorrow night. He wasn't privy to the conversations, but he said it was easy to spy on them. He confirmed the terrorists plan to blow up the facility with a team of 6. The boy, the leader of the 3 escapees, will be amongst them. His name is Jacques."
Li nodded thoughtfully.
"Excellent work, Shu. The general will be pleased with this. If your source is correct, and we thwart the teenage idiots and capture this boy, you may just earn yourself a medal for your good work."
Shu's eyes widened.
"Yes, sir,"
he said, puffing his chest out and saluting.
"For your sake, though,"
Jiang Li said, leaning over him.
"let's hope your little traitor in that camp isn't feeding you disinformation. I would hate for your family to lose such a valuable source of income. That would be tragic."
Turning away from the private, he walked to the black limousine and climbed in.
"Drive,"
he said, and gestured to his bodyguard. The man carefully poured him a tumbler of his favorite American whiskey and handed it to him. Li smiled as he swirled the valuable contraband in his mouth. Tomorrow evening he would finally deliver on his promise to capture the murderer of his daughter. With his head tilted back, nose to the wind, Jack basked in the warmth of the sun and took in deep breaths of air. He wanted to savor the day just a little more, because he knew full well it could possibly be his last. The roar of the truck had become a comforting rumble that was only interrupted by groans of the gears when they slowed and veered off the road to negotiate their way around abandoned cars. Along the way south, they saw the occasional body, some more recent than others, but most thoroughly decomposed by the Texan sun. Jack turned back from the road after the last one, a small boy whose eyes had been picked out by birds, his throat suddenly feeling awfully dry. He hunkered down and rummaged for the water flask.
"Don't go finishing that off all at once,"
said Murphy. Jack made an exaggerated show of sipping just a little, smacking his lips, before twisting the cap back on the flask. "Happy?" Murphy raised an eyebrow. "Sorry," he said. "I'm feeling a little tense."
"No shit,"
Theo said, his chin in his hand, as he gazed over the fields that whipped by. Since they'd left, a few of their company had grown agitated, whilst others, like Jack, had fallen into a serene, fatalistic kind of state. From inside the cabin of the truck, Haley reached a hand out, slamming the top of the roof, which signaled to the survivors in the flatbed to hold tight. On cue, she took a sharp left off the asphalt, down a short decline, and onto a long, bumpy dirt track heading toward a spattering of oak trees and grass. Beside it, about 5 minutes down the track, a few old farm buildings loomed, and Jack realized the spot would be a perfect base to hide their gear for the return journey. He clung to that particular dream with both hands. The return journey. When the truck stopped and they climbed out, Jack stood back to drink it in. The blue Ford nestled beneath the low branch of an oak tree, hidden behind the north-facing wall of an old farmhouse, the rust-red paint flaking off its wooden cladding. They'd make it. They had to. Theo pushed a heavy crate of ammo into his chest. "Don't just stand around, bro." "Sorry," he said, and carried the heavy box into the barn, dumping it with the rest of the equipment. The entire group worked silently, happy to let the chore occupy their thoughts from the dangerous task in front of them. Jack noticed Haley making sure everything was stacked neatly, even taking time to redo some of the stacks. Aide seemed most at ease. The man of few words seemed so at peace with everything that was happening that it almost began to annoy Jack. What is this guy's deal?
"All of you,"
Haley shouted before Jack had a chance to ask Aide his secret.
"into the barn, now."
Haley disappeared back inside, and the rest of them followed her. Laid out on the boxes that she was using as a makeshift table, Haley had placed a big map, weighed down by 2 boxes of ammunition. There were various lines and circles drawn on the paper. They gathered around, most perspiring from the heat in the poorly ventilated barn.
"This is where we are now,"
Haley said, her voice echoing amongst the rafters above. She pointed to a spot just a few miles from the outskirts of Houston, amongst farms, sparse suburbs, and woodland.
"And this is the shiny new fuel facility the Chinese built."
She jabbed the pen about 3 or more miles southeast of their position at a blank spot on the map.
"It looks like vacant land on the map, but I can assure you there's a full operation going on there. The facilities already in place were destroyed by Americans before the virus took full effect, so they had to start from scratch. Along with imports from their other bases of operation, this one facility provides all the gas needs for the People's Army in the state of Texas. So," Haley continued, "you've heard it all before. We've run the plan, but this is crunch time, so I'm going to run it again so we are all clear on mission objective. Okay?"
Nods all around the table. Jack's heart was starting to pump faster now. This was it. No going back.
"Good."
Haley jumped straight into the strategy of the mission, explaining the crucial need for formation, stealth, and nonverbal communication. She reiterated on the map the entry points to the facility and the exit point to meet, if all went well. Then she explained about the charges. With little or no experience with explosives, the group would have to rely on instruction and mindfulness when placing the C4 they had accumulated. They wouldn't need to use a lot if things went well. They were igniting fuel, after all. But with such a small amount, the chain reaction would be crucial. Repeating herself 3 times, Haley showed them one by one how to place the charges and set the timers. With the plan run through and workshop on C4 complete, they picked up their weapons. Even though they had been cleaned the morning before, Haley insisted on checking them again, with Jesse watching everyone to make sure they were doing as they were told. There would be no safe margin of error. Jack, now worryingly comfortable with firearms, did his in record time and stood ready, with his silencers attached. Jesse then went person to person and applied black paint to their exposed skin.
"Remember," Haley said, when Jesse finished applying the face paint, "the silencers will not muffle the shots like the movies. They'll still make a hell of a pop. So last resort, okay? I want you all to show me your knives, just to be sure."
On command, they unsheathed their hunting knives, holding them up for Haley to see. Jack watched as Haley armed herself, tying her hair back into a black hat, which had been offered to Murphy, Jesse, and Theo, whose own hair had grown out a little. They exited the barn, shut the doors, and walked to the edge of the yard. The sun was now setting on the horizon, and a chorus of crickets filled the late afternoon.
"It's a 3-mile hike,"
said Haley.
"Just under an hour if we keep a steady pace. I don't want bunching, so I want a good 10 paces between you all. Let's go."
She took out her walkie-talkie.
"Camp Lisa, this is Fox 1. 3 miles out. Mission a go. Over."
A crackle returned, with Grandpa's voice. "Mission go, Fox 1. Camp Lisa has your back. Over and out." Jack took a deep breath and fell into step behind Aide, who led the way. Operation Underdog was officially underway. Chapter 12. 2 miles into their bleak march, trudging through fields, sweating from the efforts and the Texan heat, Jack spied a tumbleweed trundle by and chuckled, not believing he'd actually seen a tumbleweed outside of a Western movie. When it fell, darkness was a relief from the heat. The clear sky above them was like a studded blanket, and the stars were joined by a waxing moon. It would be a week before it was full, Jack figured. Cooler the night might be, but more than once he stumbled on rocks and dips in the ground. After an hour of walking, a glow on the horizon became apparent, and soon, unmistakable, tall, narrow structures loomed. The fuel facility. Jack wet his lips and adjusted his grip on his rifle. The strap had slowly dug into his right shoulder, and his forearms ached from relieving it of the weight. Despite his talent for shooting, he'd never had to carry a fully loaded automatic rifle, along with a laden backpack, 3+ miles before. He reminded himself that soldiers in the U.S. military would have had to do this nearly every day and night, and his respect for them increased. It wasn't just the backpack and guns that weighed him down, though. It was also the mental pressure of the task at hand. Now, with less than a mile to go, the fences to the facility slowly materializing out of the blackness and trees, Jack was fatigued and beginning to lose some of the energy and enthusiasm he'd had when they set out. At the fence, Haley moved left and crouched, waiting until the others, finishing with Jesse, who was bringing up the rear, had joined her. Dissatisfied with their spacing, Haley raised her hand and gave them a sign to move in closer. They followed the command quickly and quietly. Haley reached into her pack and withdrew wire cutters, making quick work of the hastily erected fence. It was clear the Chinese had built the complex hurriedly, and perhaps with less care than if they'd had unlimited time. Soon she was able to pull the hole in the mesh wide enough for them to begin crawling through. Once they were all on the other side, Theo and Jack held the hole open for Haley to pass through. She gave the signal to spread out and crouch low in the grass to break up their shapes in the dark. Jack peered out across the facility. It was a sprawling scattering of low operational buildings, 3 large cylindrical fuel tanks, and a tall tower whose purpose was a mystery to him, with the structures connected via a complex array of pipes and feeds. Truth be told, he had no idea how any of it worked. He'd never been to a fueling complex before. All he knew was that this one had to be burned to the ground, one way or another. Jack turned back quickly, so as not to miss Haley's next signal. This was it. Her hand went up into the air and gave the go for them to fan out to their respective areas. With the map plans imprinted on his brain, Jack moved with his partner, Murphy, and approached the first building, crossing a stretch of hard ground. To their left, Haley and Aide went one way, and Theo and Jesse went another. Holding up a hand, Jack motioned for Murphy to pause while he checked out the side of the building they'd come to. There was no sight nor sound of the enemy. He gave the all clear and they crept forward, hugging the edge of the building, navigating a few stacks of boxes, before reaching a back door. Rising, Jack peeked through the small window to the side of the door. There were 2 Chinese soldiers inside, playing cards at a table. He ducked back down and gave the nod to Murphy, and they moved on. Rifles at hand, but knives ready for their primary choice of attack, they padded quietly across another stretch of open ground to the next building. Again, they checked the windows, being careful they didn't get spotted. And in this building, Jack and Murphy saw a handful of officers conversing over some paperwork. Odd, he thought. Everything seemed so calm, and they had yet to come across any armed guards. It was almost going too smoothly. A few seconds later, he had cause to curse himself for tempting fate. A guard appeared from the other building, strolling toward their location in the shadows. Jack and Murphy ran away from the building, ducking quickly behind a parked truck. With hearts pumping hard, they moved slowly to the rear to remain out of sight of the approaching soldier. Finally, he passed within just a few feet and entered the officers' building via a side door.
Jesus,
Jack mouthed to Murphy, whose eyes were wide with terror. She shook her head in disbelief, then pointed ahead of them, toward the end of the long line of buildings where the set of tanks they were to place their charges on sat. Jack nodded, and they returned to the shadows, hugging the buildings in a crouched run as they headed towards the large tank. They had darted across another space and were on the move again when a door opened and a soldier stepped out into a pool of light, stopping them dead in their tracks. The soldier's mouth dropped open, the cigarette he had been about to light up balancing precariously on his bottom lip. The 3 stared at each other. Frozen, no one reacted until a distant scream carried through the night air and jump-started them into action. Hurriedly, Jack raised his rifle and squeezed the trigger, but so surprised had he been, he hadn't placed his feet correctly, and the recoil sprayed his bullets into the side of the metal-clad building. Swearing in Mandarin, the soldier scrambled for the pistol at his side, but Murphy squeezed off a burst of fire that sent him clattering into the side of the building, then onto the ground, where he laid unmoving.
run!
Screamed Murphy, as shots of gunfire lit up the night. Jack didn't have to be asked twice. Sticking to their original course, they sprinted towards the big cylindrical tanks. Glancing over his shoulder, Jack saw soldiers sprinting this way and that, already armed, almost as if they had been waiting for a disturbance. There was a shout behind them, and a line of bullets stitched the wall to his left.
In here!
Jack called, veering to the left amongst a forest of copper piping. They weaved their way deeper, putting copper pipes and vats between them and their pursuers, then veered towards their target. The gunfire behind them ceased, the guards obviously concerned about a stray shot igniting the fuel around them. When Jack paused to see if they were being followed, he couldn't glimpse any Chinese uniforms amongst the pipes. Catching his breath, he motioned to Murphy to take a sharp right, and the pair ducked down behind some sort of unit, which offered them a bit of extra cover.
"There's no one there," he said. "We're not being followed."
Murphy peered up over the unit, back the way they came, and Jack saw her blanch.
"We are," she gasped. "They're just not shooting. They're still coming in." "Shit. What do we do? We can't shoot them and they can't shoot us."
Jack scrunched up his face. He knew what might have to happen. "How many of them are there, do you think? I counted 4.
"Same,"
Murphy said.
"Shit,"
Jack said. "We're going to have to use these." He adjusted the strap on his rifle so that he could slip it onto his back, where it sat snug next to his backpack. Then he pulled out the long hunting knife by his side. Murphy stared at it, as if it was about to come alive and strike her.
I,
she stuttered, fear taking grip.
"I don't want to either, but,"
Jack said, his voice starting to shake as the sound of hurried Mandarin floated over to their location, the soldiers nearing them with every step.
"We have no choice. We could run for it. They can't shoot us, can they?"
"But they will," he said, "the second we leave this area."
"Couldn't we—"
Murphy's face contorted as she struggled to come up with an alternative to melee combat.
"Couldn't we run into the open and turn on them with our guns and blow the whole area up?"
"And us along with it," Jack said. He held up the knife grimly and gripped it tight in his right fist. "It's our only option." Murphy seemed on the verge of hyperventilating for a moment before she closed her eyes, reached for the knife, and steadied herself. Jack watched in awe as she calmed and adjusted herself. Already, war had changed who they were. In the before days, at this time of evening, they would normally have been in a warm bedroom, studying algebra or history. But instead, America had fallen, and they had seen war, death, and were now on the edge of their own demise. The enemy's voices were close now. Their time was up. Jack held up 3 fingers and slowly counted them down, nodding to the left and right to indicate which way she should go. Murphy understood. When he got to 0, he and Murphy sprang from either side of the unit, knives ready, and launched themselves at the unsuspecting soldiers. Jack didn't allow himself to be distracted by what Murphy was doing. He was focused on his immediate target. Ahead, a tall soldier flinched at the unexpected movement, but was barely able to swing his rifle more than an inch or two when Jack had tackled him, jamming his knife under his ribcage, driving it deep and holding the soldier in close until he stopped struggling. Blood gurgled from his mouth and down his chin as Jack gently laid him down. Jack disengaged, his head pounding, adrenaline coursing through his body, and stood up to take stock of his surroundings. He spotted Murphy 20 feet away, struggling with a soldier, blood splattering the ground. He didn't have time to ponder whose blood it was, because a 3rd and 4th soldier tackled him to the ground in a tangle of limbs. A fist struck Jack in the temple, and light danced in his eyes as the knife was knocked from his hand.
"No!"
He scrambled, fingers ferreting in the dirt, but couldn't find it. Instead, he found the groin of one of the soldiers and squeezed it with all his strength, whilst taking a second blow from the other soldier, this time to the jaw. The soldier's scream was high-pitched, and the effect was immediate as he rolled away from them, clutching his groin. Unperturbed, the other soldier pinned Jack, wrapping his meaty hands around the boy's throat. Static materialized on the edges of his vision as he gasped for air and tried to pry the hand away from his throat. It was useless, and he felt himself begin to lose consciousness. With one last supreme effort, he reached around in the dirt for his knife, and this time found the blade. Unmindful of the cut he inflicted in his palm when he gripped it, he pulled it to him and with numb fingers found the handle and drove it up under the chin of the Chinese soldier. Blood poured from the wound, splattering Jack's face, seeping into his eyes and mouth. The soldier convulsed and collapsed on him. With great effort, Jack rolled him over, exhausted, and stood up to see Murphy, sinking her blade into the chest of another soldier. Murphy turned to Jack, saw the blood on him, then on her own hands, and dropped the knife, shaking.
"I'm all right. It's his blood. What about you?"
Murphy touched the gash on her forehead.
Just this. But oh my God, Jack. I killed them.
Jack grabbed her shoulders and looked at her. Don't let it sink in. Forget it. If you hadn't killed him, he would have killed you. Come on, we have to move. They know.
What?
She asked.
What do they know?
In the distance, they heard gunfire and more cries. This is an ambush, he said. They knew we were coming. Chapter 13. Haley was suspicious from the moment of her and Ade's first encounter. Her Asian appearance caused confusion for the first soldier they ran into, and she took advantage of his hesitation, crossing the space between them and slicing his throat with a vicious flick before he could come to his senses. Ade had taken the second guard in a bear hug, snapping his neck with his powerful hands barely 30 seconds later, before a shot or scream had gone up. They were stealthy and quick, just like they had practiced. But the sudden appearance of a large number of soldiers from a group of buildings opposite the largest fuel tanks told her something wasn't right. The invaders were expecting trouble, and this was almost certainly an ambush. A soldier screamed. They had been spotted.
Run!
Haley screamed at Ade, and she ran for a small building, throwing herself through the window as gunfire erupted behind them. Ade fell to the floor beside her, wincing as broken glass penetrated his shoulder and leg. Inside, a surprised shoulder shot to his feet and scrambled for a handgun on his desk. Haley was on her feet almost preternaturally fast, and her throwing knife took him in the eye, causing him to fall back onto his chair, dead. Haley turned back to Ade as he struggled to his hands and knees, blood pouring from a wound on his leg, where a large shard of glass had launched itself. He pulled it free, and thankfully, the blood didn't flow any faster. The gunfire had abated, but the shouts of soldiers were coming closer.
Stay down and don't move,
said Haley, crouching so she was below the window as she moved to the desk, where she freed her knife from its victim and proceeded to cut the sleeve of his uniform at the shoulder. She went back to Ade and quickly and efficiently wrapped the material tight around his thigh.
How is it?
She said, taking a peek through the broken window. The soldiers with guns were advancing, 5 of them.
Can you stand?
Yeah.
Good, because after we've dealt with these 5, we will have to run to the first tank and place our charges. They know we're here, and we won't have much time. Do you think you can run on it?
Ade gritted his jaw. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Haley knew it hurt, but she also knew Ade was like a tank. When the time came, he would push through the pain and do what he had to do. Haley motioned for him to take the other, smaller window on the far side of the office unit, while she flicked her rifle to automatic, and crawled to the broken window. Ade flicked off the lights as he went past the switch.
Good thinking,
she thought. More distant screams and gunfire lit up the night, and Haley knew the other teams had been engaged. Burying her concern, she placed the barrel of her weapon on the sill and carefully set her sights. The 5 soldiers had separated, 2 on the left and 3 on the right, one group obviously intending to circle around and enter from the rear.
No, you don't,
she whispered, and gestured to Ade he should take care of the 2 on his side. He nodded. Haley turned back and fired at the 3 who were closest to her. Her first volley took down the leading soldier, but the return fire was instantaneous and almost took her head off. Ade followed suit from his side of the building, laying down fire. He held up 2 fingers to Haley, and she responded with 1. 3 down, 2 to go. Gunfire continued for a full minute, peppering the building and sending glass and splinters of timber flying over her. Finally, it abated as the enemy reloaded, and both Ade and Haley opened up. The remaining soldiers had taken cover behind a vehicle, and when Ade and Haley stopped to reload, they opened fire again.
Shit,
she said. They were pinned. They needed to try something before reinforcements arrived. Scuttling over to Ade, she whispered in his ear.
Let off some fire, then scream and slump back when they return. I will do the same. You crawl over to the door. I'll be lying under the window playing dead. When we have a shot, take it.
Ade took the order and gave Haley a thumbs up when she had made it back to her window. They began firing again. After a burst of return fire, Aide let out a scream that would have done an Oscar winner proud and slumped to the floor. He was on the move immediately. Haley fired again for good measure, then also gave out a cry and ceased her firing as she rolled onto her front, her weapon outstretched but fingers still on the trigger. There were a few more sporadic bursts of fire before she heard harsh whispering close by and getting closer. It appeared they had taken the bait. With her heart beating hard, Haley waited. Theo placed the charge on a tank, right in the heart of the facility, whilst Jesse checked his flanks. Sweating, nervous from the sound of fighting all around them, and knowing they had possibly been expected, he set the charges to blow in 5 minutes. "Done," he muttered. They had just one more to do in their section of the facility. Ambush or no, he and Jesse hadn't been spotted yet, and with the work they'd done, it would almost guarantee a chain reaction, not allowing the Chinese time to disarm them, even if they found them. Even one charge exploding would still cripple them enough to ruin the fueling operation for their Texas command.
"You think it's a trap?" Jesse called back to Theo. "The other teams have been engaged, but we came in so quietly."
Theo let out a very slow, shaky breath as they hurriedly crossed the gap between the two large tanks.
"It's the only explanation,"
he said, reaching the big smooth tank just ahead of her.
"But we need to focus on our task. The others will have to look after themselves. Cover me. I just have one left." "Hurry up," she whispered. "I get a feeling our luck might run out."
He took the last charge from his backpack, knelt down by the tank wall, and placed the C4 up onto the cool metal exterior, pressing in on the sides to make sure it had stuck before he started to program the detonation sequence. By the time he was done, his hands were shaking.
"Done," he yelled. "Let's get out of here until the rendezvous." "Shit!"
A stray bullet flew by his head. Theo threw himself to the ground, biting his tongue as he rolled and feeling the coppery taste of blood fill his mouth. Jessie spun around, ready to return fire.
"Don't fire, Jess."
Her eyes widened as she realized the danger of a firefight so close to thousands of gallons of gasoline. She squatted next to Theo.
"We need to run for it," said Theo. "A stray bullet could light us up like the 4th of July." "Agreed. After 3?
Fuck that," he said, standing up.
"Go, now."
He leapt from his hiding spot and sprinted away from the tanks, with Jesse in tow. Ahead of them, across open ground, they saw no cover. To their right, however, there was a small parking lot with a few trucks, cars, and a van, all typical military, with the one exception, a long, dark sedan.
"There!"
Theo screamed, flinching as bullets whizzed over their head as they fled across the yard.
"Head to the vehicles! Cover!"
Jessie's panting just behind him confirmed she was keeping up. Finally, they reached the parking lot and sprinted behind the first truck, skidding in the dry Texan dirt before hunkering down. They sheltered at one of the large rear wheels so they wouldn't get picked off at the ankles. Shouts indicated the soldiers who had discovered them were hot on their tails. Theo dropped to his stomach and peered back the way they had come. Jesse watched as he moved his rifle into position and aimed it back under the truck. She followed suit at the rear of the wheel. A burst from Theo's rifle took 2 down, and a third soldier fell to Jesse's well-aimed shot to the head. But more appeared to replace them, and their heavy fire had Theo and Jesse ducking back behind the wheels. With their backs to the hard rubber of the tires, Theo spotted a pair of soldiers rounding a vehicle in the distance and heading their way, although they seemed to be unaware of their presence. On a hair trigger, Theo fired at them without thinking, and cursed when he missed, succeeding only in alerting them.
"Fuck."
The soldiers took cover and began to return fire.
"Shit!"
Jesse screamed.
"We're screwed."
"No," he said.
"We got this."
He raised his head, looking for the soldiers in front of them. A shot struck the tarpaulin side of the truck barely a foot above his head.
"I'll take care of those 2. You go for the ones behind us so we don't get flanked, got it?" "Yes," she said,
reloading and chucking the empty magazine aside. She got back down and took aim under the truck. Theo reloaded too and had barely raised his weapon when a harsh scream of Mandarin from a truck to the left told him the 2 soldiers that he'd engaged had split up. A man with wild eyes wielding a handgun charged at Jesse, who was already firing her own weapon at the threat approaching from behind and totally unaware of the danger behind her.
"No!"
Theo yelled, swinging his rifle around as the running soldier began shooting. He squeezed the trigger and watched the man jerk as his momentum was halted, and he fell to the ground, dead. Jessie continued to fire under the truck, oblivious to the fact that he'd just saved her life. Unfortunately, Theo's attention had been occupied too long. The sound of running footsteps behind him told him he'd been bested. He waited for a hail of bullets in the back. Sensing something was wrong, Jessie spotted the looming shadow behind Theo and quickly switched positions, raising her gun in her friend's direction. Understanding this was his only chance, Theo collapsed to the ground to give her an open shot, but not before the soldier fired and he felt hot pain lance his back just above his right hip. He buried his face in the dirt as Jessie opened up, felling the man who shot him before she dropped to the ground and rolled, taking down another soldier who was rounding the truck before her gun clicked empty. The last soldier poked his head around the corner as Jessie struggled to reload. Smiling, he emerged and aimed his weapon at her.
"You're fucked,"
he said in perfect English, and squeezed his trigger. Nothing. He squeezed again, the smile slipping. When Jessie pulled out her pistol, he slapped his open hand on his rifle frantically.
"Ni hao, motherfucker!"
Jessie screamed, and the soldier bucked twice as she emptied 2 bullets into his chest and skull. Theo was impressed. Jessie had reached him before the man had even had a chance to fall to the ground. Swift as the wind, she was at his side, pulling up his shirt and examining the wound on his front, whilst he clenched his jaw to stop himself from crying out.
"Exit wound,"
she said to him, eyes welling up.
"It's the exit wound. Thank God. Yeah, got me in the back. I'll live, I think,"
Theo managed to say, watching blood seep from the ugly wound. She pulled a thick wad of gauze from her small backpack and pushed it against the exit wound.
"Keep pressure on it with your hand. We have to move."
With great difficulty, Jessie helped Theo up where he leaned unsteadily against her.
"How long do we have?"
she asked as they made their way across the parking lot, weaving between vehicles toward the rendezvous point. Theo checked his watch and wished he hadn't. 3 minutes and 23 seconds.
Shit.
Chapter 14. Haley heard footsteps just outside the window, but forced herself to wait. Finally, she heard heavy breathing and a whisper of triumph. Simultaneously, her eyes snapped open. She raised the gun a few degrees and squeezed the trigger. Aide had done the same. The 2 Chinese soldiers jerked and spasmed under the onslaught, falling onto the ground, only one managing to let off a wild burst of fire as he collapsed. Haley felt a sting on her right cheek. "Yes," rasped Aide. Haley wasted no time checking the wound and immediately climbed to her feet, offering her hand to him.
"No time to celebrate," she said. "Can you walk?"
Jack finished arming his charge, while Murphy finished with hers. Their timers were set to blow at the time they had all agreed to. The detour and fight had delayed them. They now only had 2 minutes. He stepped back, judging it to be secure, and raced across to Murphy. The blood-soaked Murphy wiped her hands on her pants, then set her timer. "You good?" Jack nodded. "Done." From across the facility, a loud chorus of assault fire spurred them on. He prayed silently that the others would survive the onslaught and that they would escape without any further casualties. Robert's dead face floated across his vision, only dissipating when Murphy shook him, her eyes full of concern.
"Jack, we can't afford to lose it now,"
she said, her voice cracking. "Sorry," he replied, shaking his head. "Do you remember the rendezvous point?"
"Yeah."
"Good. Is your weapon fully loaded?" Murphy gave him the thumbs up. Jack checked his again, too. "Come on," he declared. "Let's get home." With Jack leading, the pair slinked back through the pipework from where they'd come, passing the dead enemy combatants, and paused only when they heard more gunfire. Exchanging looks, they continued cautiously, glancing to their flanks and all around to make sure they weren't being snuck up on. Someone knew they had planned to hit the facility tonight, which meant that not only could more numbers be lurking, ready to make sure they didn't make it out alive, but that someone close to the camp, or within the camp itself, had leaked information to the Chinese. A mole within Camp Lisa. The thought churned in the acid of his gut. The possibility of betrayal. It made him sick. Gripping his rifle tighter, he continued on. Jack peered back down his iron sight, checking for movement, and briefly wished for night vision glasses. He froze when he spotted movement in the shadows of a long, low building, 30 yards away. 2 figures, moving slowly. One of them was limping. His wide frame was unmistakable. Aid.
"Murphy,"
he whispered and began to move forward.
"It's Haley and Aid."
Haley spotted them at the same time and moved her hand urgently, almost frantically. Not seeing the immediate danger, he hesitated, and it almost cost him his life. From behind the buildings at their rendezvous point, 50 yards distant, a large group of the enemy emerged. There were dozens of them. Heavy gunfire erupted.
"Shit!"
Murphy and Jack screamed in unison, throwing themselves behind a low wall, hitting the ground hard. Jack swore, feeling his right shoulder jar from the impact. Bullets thunked into the cinder block wall and whizzed over their heads. Jack crawled to the side and peered around carefully. Haley and Aid had disappeared, hopefully into safety. The cacophony of enemy fire made it hard for them to hear each other, but Murphy's shout finally reached his ears.
"Where are the others? Can you see them?"
"I don't know," he yelled back. They were pinned now, blocked from escape. Jack slipped off his backpack, taking out the last magazines of ammo. Murphy did the same, their backpacks now significantly lighter with only basic medical supplies left in them. Would they need to use them? Jack didn't think so. He wasn't sure they'd make another 5 minutes. Jack held his weapons single-handed over the wall and shot off the last of the ammo. He then ejected the spent magazine and hammered home a fresh one, then sat back against the wall, feeling hopeless. He blinked, then pictured Katie's face. Pictured the spot at the camp where he had fought his first group of Chinese soldiers. Remembered putting the first shovel full of soil on her grave. His heart filled with new rage. And without telling Murphy of his intention, he stood up from the cover of the wall, a cry of anguish erupting from his throat as he fired at the enemy. He didn't know how many he hit, or how close he came to dying. But he seemed to be shooting for an eternity, the rattle of his weapon shaking his body and the blazing muzzle flashes of the Chinese soldiers lighting up the night. He was waiting for their bullets to put an end to him. But it was a sharp tug at his belt, pulling him downwards hard, that finally put him on the ground. Still in a frenzy, he turned his gun on Murphy, who bravely slapped him across the cheek, snapping him out of his bloodlust. "I'm sorry," he whispered, putting his hand to his face. "It's over, Murph." Radio static burst from Jiang Li's walkie-talkie.
"Sir, we have engaged,"
said the voice of his ground commander, gunfire in the background threatening to overwhelm his words.
"Perfect," he replied. "Make sure there are no survivors. And if even one of those charges goes off, it's your ass on the line. Understand? Over."
There was a pause, punctuated by more shots.
"Understood, sir. Over,"
came the strained response. Li put down the device and picked up a tumbler of American whiskey on ice he'd been nursing nervously for 20 minutes. He rolled the cool glass across his forehead before taking a gulp. Through the door opposite, Lieutenant Wong emerged. "Colonel," he said, standing to attention and saluting. Jiang Li smirked.
"At ease."
"Sir." He relaxed and gestured at the seat in front of Li's desk. "May I?"
"You may,"
Jiang Li replied. Wong settled down into the seat and the two regarded each other. Jiang Li raised his glass up and pointed to it with his other hand.
"I await an update that the survivors we ambushed, thanks to your intelligence gathering, are dead.
When I do, I will pour you a glass. Do you know what it is?
No, sir.
It's a 2013 Michter Celebration Sour Mash whiskey. It used to sell for thousands of dollars a bottle. I took this one from the governor's mansion. It tastes like Yankee tears to me.
Yes, sir. I would be honored to try it.
Don't get ahead of yourself. There is some work for them to do before we celebrate.
Yes, sir. May I speak freely?
You may.
After this, what next? Camp Lisa?
Jiang Li smiled.
Yes. You will snatch your informant and have him lead us to the enemy camp, and we'll hang this leader, the old man, while they all watch.
Having escaped the building and crossed a darkened path to a trailer, Haley and Aide bunkered down in the shadow of a boiler. In the space between both ends of the building, she could see figures running. Lots of them, and they were armed to the teeth. They were trapped. She put a hand to her cheek, and it came away smeared with blood. It had run in thick rivulets down her face and was seeping under her vest and shirt. She looked at Aide, who, now that the adrenaline had worn off, looked as shocked at her appearance as she felt. That stray bullet had been just an inch away from killing her. Shaken by the near miss, she hunkered down next to him and tried to collect her thoughts. Aide clutched his rifle close to his chest and bowed his head, his lips moving without making a sound. Haley knew she'd remember this image of Aide, injured and bleeding in the dirt beside her, praying to survive the night. Shrugging off the backpack, she shuffled closer and gestured she was going to look at his wound. He flinched as she parted the torn fabric of his pants. It was deep, and dark blood pooled in the 2-inch-long slit, but it appeared to have stopped bleeding. She deftly unwrapped the bandage and wrapped it tight around his thigh.
I guess we're doomed, right?
Aide said, looking at her as she put her first aid kit back in the backpack. His words hit her hard, and she felt a lump rise in her throat.
I'm sorry,
she said.
I didn't.
Aide's hand on her arm stunned her to silence.
We did our best.
We did, didn't we? And we'll go out fighting. But first...
She paused and reached to the bottom of her pack. When she pulled her hand back out, it was holding a military-grade flare gun. She looked at him.
I was hoping we wouldn't need to call on him. But we have to make sure this wasn't all for nothing.
Aide nodded. In one quick motion, she put her arm straight up into the air and pulled the trigger. The blazing, hot red comet soared through the night sky, searing a white line into her retinas as she watched it arc far over into the fields, away from sight. As the excited voices of their hunters greeted the flare, there was no doubt in Haley's mind that her father, who promised to be airborne for a full 2 hours during their mission, would see the signal. She dropped the flare gun and picked up her rifle.
Come on, Aide.
Theo muttered, angry at himself for letting the soldier get the drop on him. Hand on his side, he looked up at Jesse with tears in his eyes and apologized. With reinforcements coming from all directions, they had been forced to ground behind a bus.
I fucked it,
he said, pounding the ground.
Don't be an ass,
Murphy shouted back to be heard.
We aren't dead yet. Look at me. I am, and all I see is a baby bitching about a flesh wound.
Her scornful words cut through his self-pity better than a slap across the face may have. She saw emotions war briefly on his face before finally he burst out laughing. Jesse joined in, and for a brief moment of madness, they fell over each other, laughing hysterically. Their mirth was interrupted by a bang and an incandescent glow in the sky. They broke away and followed the flare high into the night sky with their eyes.
Haley just called in Betsy,
said Jesse quietly.
That means her and Aide are in trouble, too. So Grandpa is... Yep, he's gonna light it up.
They were hoping not to have to use the plane, 'cause it's likely to trigger a last-ditch effort to weed out the camp. It's last resort, and she wouldn't have called him in if she didn't have to.
His eyes widened.
Which means, not only are the charges about to blow, but we also probably have Grandpa about to strafe us.
As soon as he said it, they heard a distant whine, like an angry mosquito.
Well,
said Jessie, getting to her feet, throwing her spent rifle to the side and plucking her handgun from her belt.
if we're gonna die in this shithole, I'm taking a few out on the way. You with me?
Theo winced as he struggled to a standing position beside her and slammed his last magazine home.
You fucking bet.
Chapter 15. By the light of the fading flare, Lieutenant Guo smirked, knowing they had the American scum pinned. Word had come in that all charges had been disarmed, and all that remained was for them to slowly close in on their positions and flush them out. He reloaded his weapon and stood up before turning to his soldiers and ordering them to march forward. With their suppressing fire coming in short bursts, Guo was smiling from ear to ear. Finally, after all the long years of training as a lowly private, he was getting to see the sort of serious action he'd been craving since he enlisted. He held up a hand and his team stopped obediently. He wanted to tease this out and hang the promise of death in front of their eyes. It satisfied him to know that they were shaking in their boots and out of ammunition, while death at the glorious hands of the People's Army inched their way. He'd give it to them soon enough. Satisfied that the fight was almost out of them, he motioned to the soldiers on either side of him to begin moving in closer to the buildings to flush them out. That was when he noticed a whining noise. It was faint, and he almost dismissed it. But when he saw his men begin to look skyward, he knew he wasn't hearing things. But no one was moving. Guo cocked his head and stared to the heavens. The jet-black night, studded by bright stars, held barely a cloud. The noise grew louder. A soldier 3 men down the line yelped, pointing into the distance just above the horizon. Guo squinted as he struggled to spot what the man was pointing at. Then he saw it. Moonlight glinting off a sleek shape growing bigger by the second. Realization dawned on him. It was a plane. An old one. In fact, it was a relic. He laughed explosively and raised his gun, but was beaten to the punch when what appeared to be fire erupted from its wings, followed milliseconds later by the sound of machine gun fire.
Run!
He screamed, but it was too late. In swooped the aircraft, white-hot metal cutting through the air and ripping up the ground, shredding his men to ribbons. He pushed one luckless soul out of the way and sprinted for the safety of a building 30 yards distant. Then, Guo tripped.
No, not now, when I am so close to glory. Not now.
The hail of metal ended his thoughts as quickly as it shredded his body. Above them, inside the cockpit, in his trusty leather pilot goggles, Grandpa gave a wave of his middle finger to the men he'd missed, who had scattered and were running in terror.
Welcome to the neighborhood, assholes!
He cackled wildly and banked, swinging around in a wide arc as he took more soldiers down. A second flyby was a risk, but he was willing to take it in order to allow as many of his people to escape as possible. He was midway through cutting another swath of men down when his ammo ran dry. Dang it. Just like that, he'd jinxed it. To add insult to injury, a few stray bullets struck the underside of his plane and the right wing. Betsy wobbled, and he banked again only to have his attention drawn by a flash. Shit! It was a small surface-to-air missile, and it was heading straight for him. He pulled the stick hard, pulling the protesting plane up at a sharp angle to avoid it.
Come on, Betsy, he grunted. Don't fail me now.
The distraction of her father's air raid and the subsequent panic of the soldiers gave Haley and Aid the one shot they needed. Still supporting him, they managed to make it to the biggest of 3 circular tanks. Aid covered her while she set charges on all 3 and set the timers for 2 minutes. It would have to be enough.
"We're done. Come on, Aid."
As painful as the wound on his leg was, the thought of being blown to smithereens was enough to make Aid bury the pain and sprint for all he was worth, managing to just keep up with Haley.
"Run!"
Haley screamed when she spied Jack and Murphy in the shadow of a building, watching a smoking Betsy just manage to avoid a missile and begin limping away from the arena. Jack and Murphy didn't have to be told twice. While the soldiers were cowering under cover for the most part, this was the only chance they'd get to escape.
"Have you seen Theo and Jesse?"
Haley panted as they sprinted for the fences. "No," said Jack. "Should we go back for them?"
"No time. This motherfucker is about to blow."
Theo and Jesse saw the soldiers scatter under Grandpa's unexpected aerial assault, and Jesse immediately tried to tug him to his feet, but Theo pulled away from her desperate grip.
"Come on, Theo. We don't have time to fuck around."
"I'm done, Jesse,"
he said, pointing down at his belly. The exit wound was leaking blood profusely now, and she could see from his pale features he was fading quickly.
"No, if we can get to the—"
"Jesse,"
he said, "I'm not gonna make it. It's bad. Don't be a fuck.
You need to go.
Get to the rendezvous point. I'll hold them off. Theo?"
Yelling and whooping broke out amongst the soldiers as Grandpa's plane gave up the fight and began to limp away, black smoke pouring from its engine. There was a fresh pop of gunfire, and Jessie looked over her shoulder. Theo took her hand and squeezed it, and she looked back at him.
"You need to go. I'll hold them off so you can get clear."
Jessie finally nodded, her eyes glinting with unshed tears. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she settled for throwing her arms around him and kissing him on the cheek, before hefting her gun and running off, without a look back. Theo's vision was blurred from tears, too, as he watched Jessie retreat. Not wasting any time, he buried his hand in his backpack and felt around until his fingers closed over a hard, round object. The grenade was heavy in his left hand as he turned to face the sound of approaching soldiers. He pulled the pin and held the lever tight against the body of the deadly device as he used his other hand to pull out his Glock. An excited yell went up, and he knew he was spotted. With all his remaining strength, he threw the grenade at the shapes rounding the corner of the big truck 20 feet distant. Excitement turned to panic, and Theo began shooting. The grenade exploded, and those unlucky enough to be in the blast zone were blown to pieces. He managed to pick 2 more off before his Glock clicked empty. He spied an enemy soldier peek cautiously around the corner, where the pistol dangled in his hand. Theo gave him the finger, and 2 Chinese-made bullets ended his life. Jessie heard the small explosion and knew that Theo had just thrown his dingle grenade. A short volley of shots sounded. Then there was a silence, followed by 2 in quick succession. Jessie sobbed as she finally cleared the car park and began running for the fences. That's when a large explosion lifted her off her feet like a gigantic hot hand and threw her into the grass, face first. The explosion of the charges and the subsequent whump of the fuel igniting buffeted Haley, Aid, Jack, and Murphy, but they managed to keep their feet. They finally made the fence and turned to watch in awe as the destruction of the 3 big tanks set off a chain reaction of smaller explosions.
"Let's get while the getting is good,"
said Haley.
"What about Theo and Jesse?" asked Murphy.
"We can't wait here. They know the drill. If we're separated, they're to make their way to the farmhouse where we left the truck. We'll wait for them there. We only put ourselves at risk if we delay here."
Murphy looked like she wanted to argue, but in the end, she simply nodded. She couldn't argue with the logic of the prearranged plan. None of them could.
"Come on."
Chapter 16. The hike back to the farmhouse and truck was silent, battered, bruised, and exhausted, and worried about the last two of their raiding party, Theo and Jesse, meant they were all lost in their own thoughts. Jack's concern was iced with a simmering anger that Haley had not allowed them to wait. While he knew from a tactical standpoint it was the right call, he didn't know how, as a human being, she could just cut them off. They reached the barn 3 hours later, after having to interrupt their progress and pause numerous times to avoid several enemy choppers and their spotlights. They entered the barn, and Haley sat them down for a debrief.
We wait here till an hour before dawn. The hour of darkness is all we need to get back to camp.
What about Theo and Jesse?
Asked Murphy.
If they're not here, we have to assume the worst and leave. That was always the plan.
So you're just going to lead them out to hang? Asked Jack bitterly.
They knew the risk,
Snapped Haley, a glimpse of her true emotions breaching the surface of her cool demeanor before she put a lid on them.
We all did.
Murphy put a comforting hand on her shoulder, and Jack left another bitter retort unsaid.
I want everyone to get some rest. I'll keep watch,
said Haley, standing up and walking away. Jack's body ached, and his ears were still ringing from the blast. He climbed into the flatbed with the others, his throat so dry from smoke inhalation that it was an effort just to swallow. He greedily finished one of the water canisters. He joined the others, who had bunched up their packs and were resting their heads on the makeshift pillows. He looked up at the darkened barn ceiling, thinking there was no way he could sleep. But exhaustion overtook his body, and he did. Jack awoke to the sound of harsh whispering. With his heart humping hard in his chest, he snapped to attention and spied Haley at the gap between the big doors of the barn. Aid was behind her, gun in hand. On full alert, Jack grabbed his pistol and jumped down from the truck, running across to Haley and Aid. Before he reached them, Haley made a noise deep in her throat and reefed the door open before running out into the darkness. Aid looked over his shoulder at Jack. "It's Jesse," he said, and followed their leader out. Jack dashed through the doors after him, and they found Haley about 30 feet away, holding a limping Jessie upright and helping her towards the barn. The young girl was pale and dirty, and she was clearly injured. She gave the boys a pained smile as they crowded around.
Give her space, said Haley. I've got her. Jack, get a blanket set up on the floor, and Aid, grab the big first aid kit from the truck cabin.
An hour later, Haley had treated Jessie's wounds. She had taken some shrapnel from the explosions in the shoulder and just above her right buttock, and also had abrasions on her hands and knees. Haley had managed to remove the small piece of shrapnel from her shoulder, but the other was deeper and would need to be removed when they were back at camp, where she had more appropriate instruments. She had cleaned all of her wounds with alcohol and bandaged them well enough to last the trip home. Haley shushed Jessie when she tried to talk about what happened to Theo. It's okay, hon. Rest for now. You're going to need all your strength. We'll talk about it all when we get back to camp. The faint light of dawn was in the east by the time Haley finished. They backed the truck out of the barn for the run back to camp. When the crunch of stone and mud under the tires changed to the smooth hum of asphalt, they all turned their heads south, toward Houston, the light of dawn displaying the thick smoke in the distance, still billowing like a volcanic eruption, filling the sky and turning the dawn red. It bled right across the horizon, and an old rhyme came to Jack then, something his dad used to say years ago, usually with his hands on his hips, staring out through the kitchen window into the distance. Red sky in the morning, a shepherd's warning. Jack thought it fitting. He cast his mind back to the fighting, and what they knew now to be the ambush. Someone had given the heads up, and that could only mean one thing. They had a mole in the camp. Watching the ribbon of road peel away from them as the sun slowly climbed into the heavens, Jack tried to consider what it would take for an American to betray their country, to betray their own people, what was now akin to family. Camp Lisa wasn't just a guerrilla camp or a rebel base. It had become a home, a place where everyone had become the proxy family they all craved, after losing everyone else when the virus had swept across the continent. So who was the betrayer? Gripping the side of the truck, now halfway to the forest, Jack adjusted his position and gritted his teeth. He had a new objective. A single objective once they got back. He would find the mole, and he would kill them.
"What do you mean they've escaped? We had them cornered. We ambushed them."
Wong roared with frustration, throwing his hat at the private who stood before him, one of few who had survived the attack at the fueling facility north of the city. He took stock of the private's left arm in a sling, the cuts on his face and singed hair, and wished it had been worse. Private Shi Lang shuffled uncomfortably and made to pick up the hat. This only enraged Wong further, who kicked at his hand and ordered him to stand to attention.
"Tell me what happened, with no bullshit, or I swear I'll shoot you where you stand," he roared.
He asked, but the lieutenant knew perfectly what had happened. Word had reached him shortly after the fighting had started, and he had expected an update in short order to inform him of success. That went out of the window, literally, when enormous explosions had lit up the night. From the big window of his office in Houston's Texas command, it played out in glorious color, signaling that the rebels had somehow, against all odds, achieved their objective. Word from Zhang Li's office had reached him and, apparently, he was not pleased. In fact, he was murderous. That meant Wong's head was on Zhang Li's chopping block, and Li's, in turn, would be facing scrutiny from above. Shit didn't hit the fan in the Red Army. It fell down from above. A scapegoat was required. Wong stomped his feet when the private hesitated to respond.
"Speak." Sorry, sir. We had the advantage."
Wong slapped him hard across the face.
"Do not lie to me."
The private yelped. His eyes bulged in shock. Wong raised his hand again to strike him.
"No, I'll tell you,"
Shi Lang cried.
"Go on." "Reinforcements. We didn't have intel about them." "Reinforcements?"
Wong asked, feigning the confusion that someone hearing of it for the first time would show, because of course he knew.
"Yes, sir. Reinforcements. An old American plane. Almost certainly the same one seen in Huntsville earlier this year. I'm almost sure of that, sir."
He took a breath.
"It came from the north, keeping low to the ground. We didn't see it until it was too late. We eventually returned fire and damaged it, but in the meantime, the infiltrators must have had time to plan more charges."
Wong slapped him again.
"Liar! You say no survivors, and yet here you are, like a turd on legs, stinking out my office. Correct your story, Private." "Sorry, sir. I was on high ground, sir, further to the outskirts of the facility. I managed, in fact, to damage the plane."
Private Shi Lang mistook the look on Wong's face to be one of approval. It was, in fact, awe that the private would take credit for allowing the enemy to escape. Big mistake.
"Oh?" "Yes, sir. I shot at the traitor and damaged the aircraft." "And did it come down?" "No, sir." "Did it perhaps land farther away due to damage?"
Shi Lang started to fidget with his sling, knowing somehow he had said something gravely wrong.
"No, it didn't, sir, but—" "So!"
Wong interrupted, his voice raising, hoping he had channeled enough of the terrifying persona of Colonel Zhang Li.
"He is not dead, and was also able to escape, and with your failure, it allowed the other survivors to escape."
Lang looked like a trapped animal. He saw no way out and lowered his head.
Yes, sir.
Wong struck the soldier twice with the back of his hand, first left, then right hand.
Incompetence! You are almost solely responsible for the destruction of the facility and allowing the rebels to escape.
Cowering, the private yelled desperately.
No, sir.
Wong's eyes bulged, shaking with rage now.
What? One of them died. He detonated himself and killed many comrades. It allowed his partner to escape just as the charges began exploding.
This does not mitigate your incompetence. You will be placed into custody and shortly be required to sign a statement admitting full responsibility for the destruction of the facility and the escape of nearly all the terrorists. God!
Please, sir,
Get him out of my sight, snapped Wong when the military guard entered.
Solitary confinement. No contact with anyone.
Yes, sir.
When the door closed, Wong circled back behind his desk and sat down before tapping the spacebar to wake up his computer. He had his scapegoat. He just had to hope that Colonel Lee would accept Shi Lang's confession. He began typing. I, Private Shi Lang, hereby state that the following is a true account of the events.